of bullying and assault. What do you know, or how would you say implementation of education regarding these issues can be done for younger schools, such as in elementary school and middle school? Because I think now what we are getting is education in college, which is way too late.
Yes, yes, and what's happening now is that more and more trans youth are coming out at earlier ages. So more trans individuals coming out in elementary school, middle school certainly, high school, when, you know, even just 10 years ago, they would not have been coming out at these ages. And sometimes I get asked by adults, like, how come there are so many more trans kids than there used to be? And I don't think that there are really more trans kids. I think it's about trans individuals coming out younger. In the same way that 20 years ago, gay and lesbian people began to come out at younger ages. And part of that was because the world was shifting. There were gay and lesbian adults that were more visible in the media, in communities, and so there was an increased sense of safety that maybe I can come out and be who I am. And I think that a similar thing happening around the visibility of trans people in the media, but also now the advent of the internet, right? And so trans young people often on YouTube finding videos and much more able to name what that difference is that they hadn't been able to express before then. And so I think you're right, the education needs to start younger. And there are a fair amount of children's books out, picture books, about kids with gender diverse expression, boys who like girls things, girls who like boys things, that are really just very open and accepting books, that girls can be whoever they want to be, boys can be and like whatever they want to like. So I think those in young grades, preschool even, can create a more open environment and enable young kids to express or feel safe enough to express gender in ways that might not be normative, stereotypically normative, and I think in elementary school as well. And again, you know, the same piece happened when gay and lesbian people began to come out, that you'd have adults saying, well, it's not okay to talk to young kids about sex. Well, sexual orientation isn't necessarily about sex, right? And I can remember one parent coming to me years ago about a 15-year-old boy who was coming to the LGBT center where I worked, to the youth group, identifying as a young gay man, and mom's question was, well, how can he know he's gay? He hasn't even had sex with anybody yet. But if you think back, a lot of kids have crushes even in kindergarten, or are sending Valentine's cards to somebody they have crushes on, certainly in elementary school. So those 5, 8, 10-year-old kids are not sexually active for the most part, but they do know who they have a crush on. And so young kids could know that in terms of sexual orientation, identifying as gay, or boys liking other boys, or girls liking other girls. And gender identity, often also true, right? I think about young kids in my life, most of them by 2 to 3, 4, are very clear about their gender identity as cisgender girls and cisgender boys. And so if cisgender kids can be really clear about gender identity by 3 and 4, trans kids could too, right? And so I think you're right that education in schools needs to happen much earlier. There needs to be more open conversation about it. When we moved from New York City to West Hartford 2 years ago, our youngest daughter was going right into middle school in 6th grade. And the first thing I saw when I was there for the parent-teacher conference that fall was that every single classroom in that middle school had a safe space sticker on it, right, as you went in the door. And again, that doesn't necessarily mean they do those things perfectly, but it does send a message to young middle school kids that are grappling with sexual orientation or gender identity that this is a safe place. And in your own practices, at agencies or private practices, I would encourage you to think about ways to create, visual ways to create a welcoming environment like that, right? Sticker, my first job out of undergrad, I think the only book at that point about lesbian and gay adolescents was this book called One Teenager in 10. And it was a collection of about 12 teenagers telling stories about being gay or lesbian. And I kept it on my desk in the residential rehab that I worked at, because I just wanted a visual symbol that if a young person was in rehab there for substance abuse and knew they were gay or lesbian, was exploring that book would signal, I'm a safe person to talk to. right? And a lot of those safe space stickers or rainbow stickers or a trans flag sticker can communicate that same thing without you having to say it out loud. So I do think that's very important. And I think a lot of the education in schools around anti-bullying, when that's connected, that really has to be a big picture so that all young people, right, in my daughter's middle school, deserve to be treated with respect, with dignity. They all deserve to bring their whole selves to school and to not have to feel like they have to park parts of who they are outside on the curb before they come in. And that when we make schools safer for LGBTQ youth, it makes it safer for all youth, right? So it's a really important piece. And for those of you that are interacting with schools, a really important piece to be aware of. So, high risk of suicide among gender diverse and trans adolescents. In fact, high risk of suicide really for all trans individuals. And the recent national survey of almost 28,000 transgender adults that was released last December, suicide, 40% of the trans adults indicated they had attempted suicide at some point in their life. And the number in the general US population is 1.6% of US adults have attempted suicide at some point. So huge to be aware of, huge assessment piece with adolescents and their families, other kinds of self-harm, like cutting, often high among trans adolescents, and much of that about gender dysphoria, if they're not able to socially transition, not being seen for who they are in the world, that gender dysphoria likely to be much higher. And so those all important pieces. And young people in child welfare systems, often running away, can be connected to gender dysphoria or experiences. And adolescents where there might be risky online sexual encounters that seem beyond what might be healthy for adolescents, hooking up in risky ways with people, sometimes particularly for young trans women, sometimes for young trans guys. It's a piece of identity validation, right? So if you're a 17, 18, 19-year-old young trans woman and everyone around you doesn't see you for who you are, and some guy you've met online wants to hook up with you, says you're attractive, you're hot, you're cute, wants to go to bed with you, then that means that guy sees you as a woman. And that can be really critical. It's pretty critical for cisgender young women, right? To think that there are people, whether they're attracted to men or women, think they're hot, think they're cute, think they're sexy, right? It's part of what feels good about us. And certainly moving into our young adult lives, right? And so it sets up the dynamic sometimes for trans youth and young adults where sex becomes one of the only places where another human being is saying, I see you for who you are, and I'm attracted to you in the gender identity you know yourself to be. So those all important pieces to explore. The other thing to remember in working with your families is that while gender dysphoria in DSM-5 is better than gender identity disorder, because at least we got rid of the word disorder, it's still in the DSM, which means it's still a mental diagnosis of a mental illness. And in DSM-5, not every trans person has to be diagnosed with gender dysphoria because it's clear that one of the criteria are a level of distress that interferes with your functioning in some way. But it's still true that any trans people seeking hormones or any kind of trans-related surgeries have to be diagnosed with a psychiatric illness. And as licensed mental health professionals, you will be gatekeepers of that process. You will be the one with an 18, 20, older trans person who has to write a mental health letter for them to begin their medical transition. And you will have to give that diagnosis. And that's something that I talk about really openly with the families and young people that I work with. And it's not an easy place to be at all, to be in that gatekeeper role. And it can really challenge the therapeutic relationship, right? Because I hold power anyway, always in a clinical relationship with a client. And now I hold the power of, I'll either write you this letter or I won't. And if you don't say the right things to me about who you are and your history of gender, I might not write this letter.
I had a client who identified as trans and had a lot of trauma, and so there was a real complication of some what others have referred to as borderline or narcissistic tendencies. And one of the things that was really difficult for me in trying to be empathic and affirming and say, like, please tell me more about this, was that every time we met, if there had been any type of affirmation, there would be a new identity piece that would be brought in the next time. So it was this constant moving target, and then these really big, explosive moments of being misunderstood in some part of identity. And what was really hard was that they were written off a lot because of that and weren't able to get the care that they needed. And when people started to be effective, something would come up with this person where they would be attacked as the therapist identity, which eventually happened with me, and I was misidentified by this person and had to explain how it hurt me. But what was difficult in that situation is that there didn't seem to be a way to be able to talk about that,
To talk about the gender identity or the other pieces?
The other pieces without I would be talking to other clinicians that were working with this person and saying like it is possible that I am miseducated. However, I seem to be noticing this, and that made everything so complicated that it was like it was almost this feeling of paralysis as clinicians. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if there are certain organizations or trainings or ways of thinking about that help people when there's multiple co-occurring.
Right. I mean, I think when there's multiple co-occurring pieces, that's always challenging, trans client or not, right? And so that's always a challenging piece. And when we're working with a client, and again, I'm not all that keen on diagnoses, personality disorder diagnoses, but when we're working with young people, adults that do have some of those characteristics, it is a challenging process of building a therapeutic relationship, sustaining it, and many times those patterns that look like borderline personality disorder criteria, often connected with childhood trauma, abuse, abandonment, and are logical responses to those kinds of experiences when they were younger or adolescents, right? And so part of it is really, I think, moving away from a pathological lens around that and really seeing many of those mechanisms as really creative coping strategies that individual developed to sustain themselves and get through very challenging experiences, right? And so part of that work often is, I think, finding ways to work with an individual from a strengths perspective and what incredible creativity and resourcefulness and resilience they have. And of course, they bond and push away because of experiences of abandonment and loss. And pushing away is a safety mechanism that worked really well at some point in the past. So I'm going to be careful when you're using that safety mechanism with me, not to pathologize it, but to really validate it as a legitimate strategy of self-protection. And I frame our work around not taking that tool away, but making sure that the toolbox has some other tools in it as well, so that they can make a conscious choice in any situation which tool is the best fit, right? So that's part of it. But I also think it's true that many times when I've worked with colleagues who are in more traditional mental health settings, and a young person or adult has other kinds of mental health issues, especially a borderline diagnosis, sometimes individuals with autism spectrum diagnosis, there's a tendency to not view the trans identity as valid, right? Or to not want to allow that individual to move forward, even with steps of social transition, meaning there's no medical interventions at that point. And it is challenging sometimes to sort that through, but trans people, youth and adults have mental health challenges just like cisgender youth and adults do, right? And sometimes that is related to internalized stigma, years of not being seen for who they are, their identity not being validated, maybe even ridiculed or abused for that identity or that gender expression. And other times, it may not be related to that, right? But it is challenging, and it means that if we're working with trans youth in particular, but even trans adults, we often have to be a very proactive advocate. Right? I write in my book, that if you're going to work with trans young people and their families, you can't be the kind of clinical therapist that just is in your office all the time and doing, therapy. You got to be an advocate, activist, therapist. Because trans youth still, lots of bullying, like you mentioned, struggles with family, lots of places where you have to show up and be their advocate, right? And hold space for them. So those pieces really important. But this sort of paying attention to when we're working with families, the fact that this is still a DSM diagnosis many times does contribute to families' perspectives on it.
Yeah, it's very interesting you talk about. Hello? I can project. So I think it's very interesting you talk about how can you be a proactive activist, especially with working with clients like this. For instance, my example is I worked at my counseling center for 3 years, and one of the ways of showing up is like having tabling, talking about opportunities, and so I really focused on the mental health awareness, right? And so one of the pieces we did was having a coming out day, right? And we didn't have any resources, unfortunately, on transgender youth. And then we also did, I went to a workshop last year that talked about trans visibility awareness.
Right.
And I remember feeling like, okay, how can I bring that back to campus and create that safe space for an individual who's going through that. And I remember one person in particular complained about it. And so I appreciate you sharing this space about sharing how important it is to know that this is a safety mechanism for them. This is something that they're used to, being ridiculed, being invisible for so long, right? And then now there's someone who's trying to be a change agent, right, by saying the counseling is here as a support system. I even decorate and have the blue and pink,
right.
Like I said, having it right there front and center. I remember having a lot of people come up to me and share their story of someone who was identified as trans. So I think it's, like you said, it's, I guess it's more of a comment. It's just making sure that we, outside of therapy, are being activists and working like, not just past social media, you know what I'm saying? So.
Right. Yeah. And the person that complained, were they
identified
as trans?
Yep. And there was a history there.
Yeah.
So.
And I have worked at times, so not every trans adolescent, young adult, or adult wants to be out about being trans. And I worked with one older trans woman 2 or 3 years ago. During that time, I think when Caitlyn Jenner had come out so publicly, and she was in her mid-60s, had been living sort of part-time as a woman in certain areas of her life, but still engaged professionally as a man. And part of what she shared with me was that before Caitlyn Jenner came out, she never had anyone look at her funny. She had totally been read as a woman. But now, with this increasing trans visibility, she was aware that people were taking a second look at her. And it was really uncomfortable, right? And so there was this push-pull around visibility, right? And that if, and it's also true that not all trans young people want to be out. The word for not being out if you're trans is stealth, right? As in flying under the radar, right? And sometimes mental health providers think that being stealth is unhealthy, just like being in the closet is unhealthy, but those dynamics are different in trans communities than in same gender or LGBT communities, because many trans adolescents that I worked with who may have socially transitioned in high school, when they're headed off to college or to their first job, it's the first time they're going to be in a social environment where no one knows their history as trans. And many trans individuals, young people included, want to be able to just live their lives as a regular guy, a regular man, a regular young woman, and not always have the label trans attached to it. And so there is a piece about going stealth that is often, for trans people, about simply being able to be who I am in the world. And it is often true, and trans people will say this, youth as well, that once I come out as trans, once somebody knows my history, no matter how visibly male or female I am, once they know my history, they don't see me the same anymore. They don't see me as a real man or a real woman. And that experience is true far too many times, even for me. So I taught I taught a class on gender identity and working with trans people in a colleague's undergraduate gender diversity course in a BSW program. First year I taught, the chair of the BSW program sat in on my lecture, wanted to learn more. The third year, when my colleague and I were debriefing after her class, she said to me, you know, every time our department chair talks about you, she uses female pronouns. Now, she met me in a suit and tie, met me as Elijah Nealy, facial hair, severe male pattern baldness. But the fact that I came out as a transgender person means she uses female pronouns. And this is a colleague, a mental health professional colleague. So now think about your adolescence. Think about going off to college. Think about having your first job. And wanting to just be seen for who you know yourself to be, right? And it is a huge, huge dynamic. And I think I have it's about a 2-minute video clip at a poetry slam here in Philadelphia, where two young people share a poem that really, for me, really captures what it's like to move through the world for trans youth and not be seen or acknowledged for who you are.
Some love for Team Philly.
The Here poem is about transgender issues. We have this one being expressed.
So is that loud enough?
Yeah.
Because the volume here doesn't seem to be moving.
It takes a little delay.
Oh, now I see, you have to hold it down. All right, great.
Through two people, one side's the boy, one side's the girl.
Melissa sits in the back of the classroom afraid to speak up. She pulls awkwardly at her extra loose khaki cargo pants. She doesn't want the boys to notice her.
James finds himself in the back of the classroom. His baseball cap casts a shadow on his pimple-stained forehead. A wide shirt hangs on his broad shoulders. But no one ever noticed him. Melissa,
the teacher asks. And she says nothing because she is not here, and Melissa has never been here because Melissa is just some abstract jumble of syllables that doesn't fit her position. She's not what she seems. She doesn't want to have to explain to her mother for the 232nd time why she doesn't want to wear a dress to prom. Doesn't paint her face, it's because the whole body's painted on.
Melissa, James doesn't want to have to explain where he came from. Because with the exception of Melissa, he has been deemed an abstract reality by everyone. All he wishes for is to get to wear a tuxedo to prom.
And Melissa has been tugging at breasts steadily growing for 3 years now. Been using duct tape to press them down and mold them more into pecs. She just wishes that people would understand that at birth, her genitals didn't know which way to grow. Mad at God who couldn't relay the message directly to her hormones that they should produce more testosterone. The only person who understands her is James. And they've been playmates since the age of 4, around the time girls noticed boys.
Boys noticed girls.
See, James's family wanted daughters
Instead of sons.
and Melissa was always like that male beetle that everyone calls a ladybug. Melissa, where is she? Sometimes she wishes she could rip the skin off her back. And every moment of every day she feels trapped in the place of a stranger. Melissa! And she stands to her feet, wanting to say, I'm here, and I've been here since I was born. So when asking me if I'm a him or a her, because when you combine the two pronouns, you get H-I-R, here. And God combined the two genders and put me in this body, transgendered. I'm here, so quit talking about me like I'm not here. James falls back into Melissa's skin, and the two comfort each other in their syncopated heartbeats, waiting for the day when Melissa can finally scrub off this made-up genetic makeup. When the teacher asks for James, and he can say, I'm here.
So, any sort of immediate reactions, thoughts, feelings that come up?
Chills.
What's that, chills?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I've probably watched that at least 100 times. And every time I watch it, I feel it in my gut, right? The intensity of that not being seen. And the panic around that, right? The huge level of distress around that. And when you think about it, trans or not, really all of us as human beings want to be seen for who we are. And we want the people who love us to see us for who we are and accept us for who we are. And so trans youth want that same thing, right? So that, I think, an important piece. So I want to get you engaged a little bit in a more, I think, active way. And so I brought some vignettes, and I think there's one on each side, so I'll probably, if there's extras at your table, move them around. So I think that I'll ask the tables that are on this side. Anybody need any, or? So I think I'll ask the tables on this side to take a look at Robert on side 1, which is vignette 2, and the 2 tables here to take a look at Damaris, which is vignette 4. And to take a moment to read through that short little vignette. And it may be too much to talk at your whole table, so maybe sort of each end of the table, 4 or so of you, talk for a couple of minutes about the discussion questions that come up.
I thought it was a protest. Yeah, right.
With the first question, what ways can you relate to Robert's parents?
So, relating to
I
Robert's
can understand.
parents,
I think I completely relate. I mean, I can understand being
especially what's going on
scared. Just like, I understand as a parent, like, I wonder if it's going to be your wife can do it. With the race aspect too. It's not going to be good if it gets caught.
Just Robert.
I guess I feel like
And so I can totally understand their feelings, especially because he will be the first in terms of any type of like, you know, relationship with the school. It doesn't even have to be. It doesn't
Like, do you guys know that they're worried, or does he just see, the if I can get them to talk about their fears and have them break down in a way, showing their emotion that's not anger, that'll make them more accessible in some ways to them.
that's what I was thinking too with the last one is how would you decide to work with the family or him individually? I was thinking I would want to work with the family, help strengthen that bond, hopefully get them to understand. So who knows, Robert's probably like, I'm very thinking. I don't want them to like me. They think I'm horrible, he's probably having some shame.
The phrase says they're worried about
Parents work on making him feel easy more. And I think that's a way how I can definitely
Thinking about how that statement, because even the one following, it doesn't take any sort of responsibility is the wrong word, but like ways for them to help with that. Like, what are ways that you want to communicate how does a young black man live in an urban area where you want to help teach him? Like, how can that be parents, empower the parents to take some ownership of it? What do they want to do?
It sounds like
Just I'm thinking of like when
if I had parents who wanted to
young black children and teaching them how to interact with
yeah, they did.
like art, do like it's like
I wonder if Robert, hearing his parents say that he's not taking, he isn't taking his transition seriously.
I feel like Robert back off of
Yeah, that's why I think they're both.
If I were Robert, that would piss me off.
Not only black, but also trans and male.
So, and then I would think his use of
So many parts of this, because
what he's going through, that it could be a way to.
so think about like how parties typically reflect on society. Maybe his need and the teaching behind that. Like,
I was thinking of
so from them, they're not looking at everything else. They're just looking at they're like, no.
because he is
But what are you doing? And then the whole
away from Vaughn, your friend,
you represent us, so whatever those
whereas you were so yeah, I was more
not maybe right, but
that what he's saying cooperative and so it could be that he's not so much interested in but the fact that it's giving him a social opportunity to be able to network with other people and not feel judged.
Just thinking about like they're changing the
That's like a whole other layer.
and now he sure understands the one. And I wonder if he's trying to fit that stereotypical identity in this environment. Before he never believed it. Now they put it hard because he's trying to build some stereotypes. Or maybe he had
but it definitely like bullied or the kids picked up
I also want to ask you who got set up to like if there's anything that happened with trauma before you ask.
Right, I get that. But usually, bullying is accompanied by, I'm smoking, I'm smoking shit, like being bullied at school. So, I don't know if it's just about school that he's at. Yeah. And then,
what I know
That's everyone, right? And people don't
obviously there is
like sort of saying like, hey, you're asking
any type of drug use, so it's definitely
for the parents. They're just using it as a
maybe the gender.
yeah.
Sorry. That was not.
yeah, exactly.
I mean, it's a tough grade. You're in a school, you have all these white people around you.
So wrap up where you're at.
most people understand school. I guess I wouldn't really know.
So I'm gonna say we start with Robert.